Welcome to Duke University's HeatWise Policy Partnership Summit. This briefing will focus on rural heat vulnerability. I'm Ashley Ward, Director of the Heat Policy Innovation Hub at the Nicholas Institute for Energy, Environment, and Sustainability, and I'll be moderating our panel of experts. So please remember, at any time during this briefing, you can submit questions using your Slido app. Okay, you ready? One thing you may not know about heat-related illness is that heat-related illness rates are often higher in rural communities compared to their urban counterparts. Everyone has done wonderful work identifying the urban heat island effect and continues to do great work. Today's session is not to discount that work or the importance of the urban heat island. Instead, it's a recognition that heat doesn't stop at the city limits. Rural communities are suffering from extreme heat and often lack the tools in the toolbox that they need to respond. Cooling centers, cool pavements, cool roofs, tree planting campaigns. These are great interventions that are fit for and work in urban environments, but unfortunately, they don't translate well to rural environments. So we're going to turn our attention today to this first session and talking about the challenges in rural communities. And so I'm going to start this conversation off with this group of panelists who have all lived and worked in rural communities for a very long time. So Leah Campbell founded and directs Mississippi Rising. Angella Dunston, longtime community organizer in North Carolina and currently with the Roanoke Cooperative. Montana Eck, who has extensively studied and written about rural vulnerability to climate change and now leads climate risk for Mastercard. And Greg Richardson, the North Carolina Commissioner for Indian Affairs. Native North Carolinian who grew up in the Sandhills, the hottest part of the state, and who serves Native American communities throughout North Carolina and in previous positions, communities throughout the U.S., many of whom are located in rural areas. So welcome everyone and thank you for joining us. Angella, I'm going to start with you. As a longtime community organizer, can you kind of give us an idea of what the primary obstacles are that rural communities face in adapting to specifically to extreme heat, but also some of the other impacts of climate change?
Well, good morning to everyone, and thank you, Ashley, for allowing me to be a part of this conversation. I always try to start with a disclaimer. I'm listed as Roanoke Cooperative, but I'm also a part of something called the Warren County Environmental Action Team. And for those of you who are familiar with North Carolina, I'm born, bred, and hopefully at some point, but longer down the road, dead in rural North Carolina. But Warren County is considered the birthplace of the environmental justice movement in America. And for those of you who don't know our history, I encourage you to do some research and learn about what has happened in Warren County when it comes to injustices to minorities and low-income communities. And I say that because oftentimes the issues that Warren County has faced are issues that other rural parts of not just North Carolina, but America has faced as well. I work for Roanoke Cooperative, which is an electric cooperative, and it's based in northeastern North Carolina. And northeastern North Carolina is considered probably one of the poorest and blackest, if that's a word, area of the state. Oftentimes, our constituents make less than $40,000. They're paying over 40% of their household income for energy bills. So it's not uncommon for me to see someone who has an $800 light bill each month, every month, all day, every day, each year. And so imagine living off of a limited income, but trying to continue to not just, and that's just one bill, that's your light bill. So then what does, and we all know the cost of food these days, what does that mean for paying for food? What does that mean for paying for medicine? So those are some of the issues that many of, I'll say, my constituents or my customers face every day. And it's something that's common in rural North Carolina. I will also just share that, and I think Jeff shared yesterday, the issue of transportation. Transportation is a major issue in rural North Carolina. The closest hospital to the area that I'm currently working in is probably an hour away, and it's not in the state of North Carolina, it's in the state of Virginia. So imagine having a heart attack or having a baby or having some other major issue. And not only do you have to wait for someone to come get you, to take you to the medical facility, but then you have an hour to drive to get there. So healthcare is also a major issue for rural North Carolina. And then you can't live in the state of North Carolina and not talk about the devastating impact of natural disasters. I was thinking the other day about just Hurricane Florence. I think, and there's someone here from INCOR, but $3 billion, I believe, was the number of the impact of Hurricane Florence alone in North Carolina. And since then, North Carolina has probably had 4 other natural disasters that people are still recovering from. So over 20 years of impact just around the issue of natural disaster. And I'll say the other issue that I have encountered is lack of information. When you live in Eastern North Carolina and sometimes in Western North Carolina, the news outlets that you receive news from are not even in your state. They're in other states. And so when you rely on information that's coming from somewhere else that has a different perspective, sometimes that information can be misinformation. And so think about people not being able to have access to accurate information to make decisions about their lives. And then the last one, because I know you want to move on, I want to talk about the issue of broadband. For many rural parts of North Carolina, broadband is a major issue. Roanoke Cooperative owns a broadband company called FIBE. But FIBE is only reaching 14,000 homes in that area, and we have so many more homes that need access to broadband, not just individuals, but school systems, those who are elderly who need to not be isolated but be connected to others. And so technology is a major issue for rural North Carolina as well. And again, Ashley, as I said to you, this could be a session for the entire conference, but I know you don't have that much time. So I just wanted to at least highlight those issues for you.
No, I agree. That really excellent start. And, the connection between communication and broadband is something we don't talk about enough. But, telehealth, you can't do that without broadband. It's very hard to get relevant, fast, accurate information about what to actually do, which leads me to, Leah, your organization works with communities throughout Mississippi and helping them on a variety of things, right? But one of them is different mitigation strategies and resilient strategies. So how does the rural setting in Mississippi influence the effectiveness of typical mitigation or resilient strategies that we might think about?
Yeah, so when we think about Mississippi, I think it's really important that we look at the entire landscape of Mississippi. So Mississippi is a population of about 2 million people overall, which is not a lot of people. So the state at large is actually very, very rural. The state also has the highest percentage of Black and brown people. So we're 40% Black people, and our fastest increasing demographic is migrant workers from Central and South America. We have the highest food insecurity rate of any state in the United States. We have the highest infant and maternal mortality rate of any state in the United States. We have some of the highest rates of chronic disease, diabetes, and heart disease. We also have one of the highest rates for energy burden, meaning our Mississippians spend a lot of their take-home pay just trying to pay for the utility bills. When I think about rural vulnerability in Mississippi, I really think about the Mississippi Delta. So the Mississippi Delta, 30 to 40% of the people in the Mississippi Delta are in poverty. In 2001, the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights released a report on the Mississippi Delta that stated that the Mississippi Delta is essentially a third world country in the middle of the United States. So when we go to the Mississippi Delta and we talk about heat, we talk about natural disasters, we talk about climate change, we're speaking with people who may live in a trailer that doesn't have part of a floor in some of those rooms, much less an air conditioner. So this is the level of poverty and impoverishment and disinvestment that we're facing in Mississippi. So when we talk about heat, layering heat on top of these things, this is a humanitarian crisis in Mississippi. And so we have to talk about very basic heat mitigation strategies in places like the Mississippi Delta, where we talk about housing, just basic housing with air conditioning. We've got to talk about lack of transportation to cooling centers, lack of cooling centers. We've got to get back to really to basic conversations when we talk about people in rural Mississippi.
I really love that you brought up the issue of, chronic disease and, the burden of chronic disease on rural populations, because we have a lot of physicians or people that work with clinics in the room, and, the literature is quite deep on the connection between, heat-related morbidity and these chronic conditions. And the truth is, people who suffer from these same chronic conditions that are disproportionately present in the communities that you work in are also those that are exceptionally vulnerable to extreme heat because of what either the treatments for those diseases or the diseases themselves do to their bodies. Right. A quick question came in I want to answer, and then I'm going to move to you, Greg, but was, the ability of cool roofs to work in rural areas. And I think the point that question came in right as you were talking about housing. And I think one of the challenges in rural communities with respect to cool roofing is that the housing stock that is in many of these rural communities, the idea of even solar, like the roofs cannot even hold the solar panel. So I wanted to give Angela, you and Leah a chance to respond to why don't technologies like cool roofs work as well in rural areas?
And I'm so glad that you brought up housing. It was one of the items on my list as well. And you're exactly right. Many of the houses households that we serve have homes that still have tarps on the top of them because they were affected by a hurricane 5 years ago or 10 years ago, and it still hasn't been completed. Houses that, as you said, still don't have adequate flooring, HVAC systems that don't work, homes that don't have insulation. And so as much as I support solar for all and all the efforts that we're working on energy efficiencies, we first have to address the issue of how do we bring housing or houses up to standard before we can even talk about energy efficiency and helping people who've been impacted by heat.
Yeah, I mean, I really can't say much more than that. By and large in rural Mississippi, homes are decades old. They might not have adequate insulation or HVACs, as Angela said. We've just really got to look at investment in basic adequate housing in rural communities.
So I think that's a great transition to you, Greg, where we talk about, how can state and federal policy, I know you've worked on both, better support rural communities, indigenous communities, but also just rural communities with extreme heat and other impacts from climate change.
Thank you, Ashley. And first of all, let me thank you again for providing an opportunity for me to be present today and to be part of this discussion. I have to tell you that this is my first opportunity to be a part of this discussion. And I have to also tell you that this is one of the first opportunities since being engaged in this process that I've thought a lot about heat and how it's impacting our population in rural communities. It's certainly impactful. But I think what I'm thinking is that I'm like a lot of others out in our society, no matter where we spring from, whether we're in government, whether we're in private sector. A lot of us probably have not thought about this impact in terms of how the heat is going to impact our communities. And certainly housing is a major area. Had a discussion earlier with a HUD representative that's here today. And we administer a Section 8 housing program, and within the parameters of that program, there's something called utility allowances. And so for the the people that are engaged in that program that are eligible, they get a utility allowance. And those utility allowances have to be adjusted based on the cost of increases in utilities from time to time. But where we run into a policy issue oftentimes is that you have a cap on the amount of assistance that you can provide, so you can only reach a certain level. So what's the backdrop from that? Well, when the family does not have enough money to pay the utility allowance, then the electric's cut off. Then the impact from that is that the landlord, or the unit rather, becomes then substandard. So the public housing agency then has to move into a process of terminating the assistance. So then comes the landlord having to do an eviction, and then you got a family out on the street. So I said all that to say that I think there's a lot of that we can do, perhaps moving forward, in terms of partnering and collaboration. Policy drives everything. So how do we get heat and this whole subject matter on the radar screen of policymakers in rural areas? Most of our country is rural, you know that. And a lot of, I should say, a lot of our country communities are low wealth, low income. And so how do we're not going to get the funding through grants and other things to solve all these problems. But I think we can start connecting dots in terms of when we're having planning discussions and we're planning our policies and everything, that we try and strive to have every sector of our community at the table when we're having those discussions. That way, we're receiving input from ground up. So in the United States, we have 574 federally recognized tribes and 63 state-recognized tribes all over the country. Now, all of these communities pretty much are in very low wealth and rural areas. So when we think about planning there, we need to also think about how we're going to connect the dots and make sure that American Indian leaders and the communities are involved in that process. County commissioners, elected officials at the local level, in rural areas need to be part of this type of discussion. So I don't know if there's a representative here from the County Commissioners Association or, our urban city government organizations, but I think that's another leg that perhaps could be included in this process. Heat covers all spectrums: health, housing, children, the elderly, handicapped, disabled. So all of these areas need to be considered when we're discussing changes in policies and implementing policies in our country.
You raise a really good point. I really love how you just kind of walked us through what the implications of one policy decision is. And one of the things I've heard, and somebody correct me because I don't know if this statistic is exactly right, but the LIHEAP program, which is the program that many people use to supplement for cooling, something like, more 2/3 of that program goes to heating homes during winter. And not a lot of those programmatic dollars go to cooling homes during the summer. And I mentioned this to a friend not long ago, and they said, yeah, by the time summer gets around, that program has run out of money. And so there's no money in the summer to distribute through LIHEAP, which is the primary program at which people use to get assistance for that. And so I think it's not just about new policies, as I think you've pointed out. It's also about how can we refine, update, modernize existing policies at the agency level even to meet this moment that's so critical. So I think that's really critical. Leah?
Just to add on to that point, Ashley, I also think it's important that we look, as we're considering these existing policies and programs that are in place, that we also consider removing barriers to entry to these programs for some folks. There's a lot of documentation and process that folks have to go through to actually apply and receive benefits, and I truly believe that some of those barriers can be removed too, and we need to look at that.
If I may follow up, one of the things that we know as Native people is that Mother Nature is speaking to us. Mother Nature is calling out to us to take action, to come up with strategies in terms of how we're going to resolve this climate change issue. we will, I'm sure, be faced with some time in terms of figuring out some of these things. But you can best be assured that Mother Nature is calling out to us in all areas to look at climate change and to look, at what we can do to basically improve conditions as the Earth heats up. So that's one of the things I need to say about that.
Yeah, thank you. And Montana, you've been so patient. Montana has lived most of his life in Appalachia. I think it's a really important, different kind of a perspective on heat, because a lot of people just don't even think about Appalachia as being a place where we have a heat problem, but we absolutely do. And then with your work at Mastercard, I really want to bring you in on this conversation. We have several questions here in Slido that relate to how data and technology can be better leveraged to predict, but also, support the response to extreme heat. And so I just want to let you have a few moments to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, thanks, Ashley. I've enjoyed all of this discussion so far. It's been so interesting just to think from an Appalachian perspective. Oftentimes we're not thought about when it comes to climate change. In Appalachia, hurricanes, no one cares. But guess what? We were impacted by Hurricane Florence as well. There's extreme rainfall after almost every hurricane event up there. Hurricane Ivan, Hurricane Francis. Extreme heat events are becoming more frequent in Appalachia as well, but they don't necessarily get the same level of attention. I also say in many rural environments and communities, they just feel like that is not the priority. When you see heat, when you see climate change talked about on the news, it's when it hits a big city. It's not talked about when a heat event hits rural Missouri, but it is talked about when it hits New York City or Miami. That's when it catches attention. So I think it's from a data side. There's a lot of data out there, but the historic climate data, it's also urban biased. That's where we've had our stations for the longest periods of time. I'll also say rural communities love to be involved in community and citizen science. All you have to do is reach out and let them know that there's leverage and opportunities out there for them to take part of. Cocoa Ross is one of those out there from a climate perspective, where you can collect rainfall data on a daily basis, helping us fill in those rainfall gaps in terms of our spatial coverage across the United States. I think it's also important, and this is kind of coming from that Mastercard lens, and there's a lot of great discussions about what's happening in the United States. There's rural communities around the globe that want to get involved in this as well. Climate change is not just a US issue, it's not just an urban issue, it's not just a rural issue, it's a global issue, and finding ways to connect these dots across the globe is really important. I just think that we have to do more to get that data out in front of folks. There's the FEMA National Risk Index, NOAA, NASA, they collect data on a daily basis, not just from stations. We have satellite data now, we have remote sensing data that we can use. It's just finding opportunities to get that out in front of folks and inviting them to events such as this, bringing them into the conversation is kind of the best way to do that. Oftentimes they're just not invited, they're not brought to the table. So it's kind of on us as the leaders in the space to bring rural communities into this, and not just typical rural communities. We got to bring Appalachia into this. We got to bring in Eastern North Carolina, Mississippi. We've got to make sure that we're reaching out to folks at their space. Make climate change a backyard issue and treat it as the global issue it is. But people care more when you bring it to their backyard and give them opportunities to give their data, give their perspective. I think that's really ultimately how we make progress on heat, as well as any other climate change issue, is bring it to people's backyard.
I want to jump in. I was trying to give you the last call. And I agree with everything you said. I'd also say, though, it's how we communicate these issues to people. Because sometimes in the communities that I work with, coming in saying, I want to address climate change, is not probably in the messaging we need to use, but thinking about, as Greg has said, the impact or the implications on heat and climate as a bread and butter issue is more of the way I think that we'll get folks in rural communities engaged. And a lot of folks are already doing the work. I mean, I'm working with a group of people who are looking for funding to ensure that homes are upfitted or upgraded with energy efficiency, HVAC systems, and other resources that they need. But it's also got to be something, and as, again, the community organizer comes out in me, from the ground up. It can't be top down. It has to be ground up. And people have to feel like they have a place and a space in the conversation. So I will say ensuring that the messenger is someone that people trust and believe and already have relationships with is one thing, but it's also how we're messaging the issue to those communities.
Trusted community voices is so important. In my work in communities, I really feel like this is one of the areas at which we maybe aren't thinking as critically about who those community trusted voices are. We've had certainly we talked about last night, clinicians, whether it's nurses, physicians, pharmacists, but there's also faith-based leaders and civic organization leaders, and tribal leaders, thank you. And we just had a great question come in. Whoever sent this question, I'm so excited you sent this, which is, what are those community institutions in rural areas that can be leveraged to receive and distribute Inflation Reduction Act funding or other kinds of big funding? I mean, one of the things that we're seeing, I know what I'm hearing is, this is almost like drinking out of a fire hose, the amount of money that's coming down. And a lot of community organizations are struggling with the capacity and capability to respond, to receive the money, to manage it, to partner. And that's a great, excellent question for this moment. I want to give this panel a chance to address it.
Take a stab at that first. I had an interesting conversation with one of the participants last night about this, and my introduction to that person about the North Carolina Commission of Indian Affairs, and immediately, I think there was 2 people actually I talked to about this issue. Immediately, they wanted to, do some work. They wanted to reach out, and they wanted to know, well, how do we negotiate that? Who do we call? Well, that's easy. In North Carolina, we got an excellent system of communications with our tribes through our Commission of Indian Affairs. They all hold membership on our commission. And in other states, there's networks like that. The other thing I thought about was through our churches. Every Sunday, all over the place, there's opportunities to push information out to the communities. And here's another grand opportunity to connect those dots. So I think that through these processes, we can achieve a lot. The third thing I wanted to mention is information. Information going out to citizen groups about climate change, heat, impact of heat. A little thing like, what happens when your body overheats? We know that it starts to shut down. I was listening to NPR a couple of days ago, getting ready for this session, and a couple of pieces from Chicago and Dallas-Fort Worth. They have cooling centers, and they were talking about, people going to those centers. Well, in rural eastern North Carolina, where do you go? Until we get policy in place where the schools can be used as a cooling center, the churches can be used as a cooling center, and county and local agency buildings can be used, we'll not get to the point where we're going to solve some of these problems.
I love that you just brought that up because, there's a lot of discussion and conversation around the efficacy of cooling centers, even in urban environments, right? There's a lot of conversation about this. Sometimes they're housed in libraries and the library closes at 5 p.m. or 6 p.m. And that's when people, actually need them. And in some of our work in North Carolina, we've been having some really difficult but deep conversations with emergency managers in the state talking about sheltering. And, because sometimes what we're needing is not just a cooling center. We're talking about sheltering services. I know that Philip is here who does this with Arizona, and this is a beast of a different color, right? This is a completely different thing than a cooling center. And so what are those places in rural communities? I love that you brought up, like, how we could use, these are places people are already going. Their church, their community center, their school, their public building housing. Like, how can you do this? I want to give anybody else though a chance to also respond to those. What are those other institutions in rural areas that can help?
Yeah, so in Mississippi, I would definitely say churches are a primary space for connecting directly to community, but also community-based organizations and grassroots organizations. We're boots on the grounds in community, knocking on doors every day, having conversations with people about what are your needs, what are the barriers you're facing. So churches, community-based organizations, schools, for sure.
So one of the things that Montana brought up, and then you brought up also, Greg, is that, how do we get data and information? Angela, you cited misinformation, and so how do we then get the appropriate information to the populations that need it? Especially because, there are a lot of people who live in rural areas who maybe aren't on social media. I mean, we're talking about the demographics of rural communities may look quite different than what we see in other communities. And so given the context of the rural community, lack of broadband, maybe unreliable access to mobile phones or the cellular network, aging populations who maybe are not as tech savvy. So how can we get information out about, viable actions that people can take to protect themselves?
Doors. You've got to find those grassroots organizations in community that we know our people, and we knock on doors and we have those conversations. We leave those flyers. We have those front porch conversations. And so we can provide information, one-on-one.
And
That's how that happens.
And I'll just say, I echo what Leah said. Having trusted influencers is the word that we use now. But for me, it was those aunties and grandmas and uncles and folks that people knew in the community. And once you get that information to those individuals and have them help you disseminate truth to the community, then that's how you get that information. And I know, Greg, in your community, very much, a lot of the elders that I've worked with and doing some of the things that we've been trying to do in communities like Warren County and Sampson County, we go through those trusted elders in the Native American community, and then those are the individuals who sanction, this is the right thing to do, this is okay, and we're gonna work on it.
Exactly. And, I think we should really highlight that as a priority. Because to get into the community and to find out what the risks are and what the potential issues are, we need to go where the people are. Get into those communities and make sure that handout information brochures, those kind of things, are reflective of the community.
Montana, I know you've talked a lot about, the social networking, social capital, especially in dispersed, isolated populations, and the need to hit those community leaders.
Yeah, and I was just going to say real quick too, even though in some of these rural communities your news station might be in a different state, they do trust their weatherman. They might joke around a little bit and say, oh, they can't predict when it rains, but people do trust their weatherman, and having them as a messenger about climate change and what the impacts are to your community, that goes a long way for folks. They do trust their weatherman. I'll say too, making sure that we're embedding climate change information in K through 12 education is really important. Grandparents learn from their grandkids. Parents learn from their kids. If I come home, if I'm a K through 12 student, come home, say, guess what I learned at school today? That resonates with them, and you can talk about events that happen in the local community. Make it state-based, make it local community-based. Let's talk about the hurricane that happened 10 years ago. I bet your parents will relate with that. Or let's talk about this heat wave that happened last year. Let's have these discussions at a local level, K through 12, community, grassroots organizations. I think it has to be comprehensive. It's not one solution is going to fit every community. It's not going to fit every single person. So we need to find ways to embed it in different ways for Appalachia, for Eastern North Carolina, wherever you are, has to be specific to that location and make it more embedded across different spectrums.
I just got to correct you, Montana. Weather woman.
Weather person. Sorry. Yeah.
Mine is a weather woman.
Meteorologist, actually.
Elizabeth
I like
Garner
that.
does not know me, but in my world, she does. Okay, so just make that correct. But I echo what you said, and I also want to highlight the importance of having that younger generation who is often on social media. I'm going to talk about my child, day in and day out, who are the individuals who get the information to help them to also disseminate that information to sometimes our elderly community, but also those who aren't on social media as much. And then how do we, again, ensure that, because I encounter this on a daily basis, misinformation is not getting to folks, and then that's what's being spreaded, and it's spreaded incorrectly. And so thinking about how we ensure that, again, trusted information gets to trusted individuals or influencer is definitely a way that we can ensure that this issue is highlighted. But I'll just say, I mean, I won't say I may not look my age. I'm still 25 in my mind. But at any rate, I just think about years ago when I worked in the local, in tobacco. My family farmed, and so worked in tobacco, 90, 95 degrees, 100 degrees. You had to get the crop in. It didn't matter what the temperature was. And just having my own heat experience and not even relating that until now, the impact of not just that on me, but elders who were in my family, my aunts, my uncles, and all of them who had so many issues, including an uncle who had a heat stroke. So just thinking about that as well as we work with those across the spectrum to, again, get back to messaging, understanding how that firsthand experience or that lived experience of what heat can and will and does do to a body is something that we need to think about when we're talking about communicating this issue to others.
So a couple of things that I think are really interesting that have come up. One is the idea of, young people going to school. And, when it came to recycling, it was teaching recycling to children in schools that they went home and told their parents, you got to do this. We can't throw this away in this way, right? And so, certainly that is very powerful, especially in households where English is not their first spoken language. And so I think a couple of things I want to ask the panel about. The first is, how are you seeing, the challenges with communication? There are a lot of people who live in rural areas who do not speak English as their primary language. And so in addition to all the other barriers that you've identified, language barrier can also be one.
Yeah, definitely. Like I said, in Mississippi, the fastest growing population is the migrant worker population from South and Central America. But we find community leaders that speak their primary language, that are trusted, that can provide that information. Yeah.
I think one thing too is important, and that's come up in a couple of questions that I see here, is, we've largely talked about what community organizations can do, what the public sector can do. There's a lot of people in this room from the private sector, and there's a lot of people here from philanthropy. And so I think, one thing we have to really be intentional about is, not letting them off the hook, right? I mean, what is the role of the private sector and the philanthropic sector in addressing some of these challenges that we've talked about?
And I'll just jump in on this one. I'll say foundations and others, corporations, have a key role in this process. I remember years ago when I worked on the issue of closing the achievement gap. It wasn't until foundations in the state of North Carolina decided that it was something that they wanted to fund that I could even get the messaging out around how important that is. And so I do understand sometimes with foundation, they work on what's the issue of the day or issue of the year, but having them to understand the importance of this, not just being an issue of today, but an issue of now and the future, is one key message that I think we have to communicate to them. And then for them to understand that utilizing your money and your funds and resources to support something like this is something that you should definitely have on your radar and you should be doing.
I'll just add, from a Mastercard perspective, I'll say we just hired, me, last year as the director of climate. This is new for a lot of corporations in terms of trying to address climate for the built environment and for their employees. One thing we're really doing is trying to engage with our employees and share out what are your climate risks for where you live and where you work. How does it differ at your work environment versus where you live in the community? Making climate risk at Mastercard not just about the office, but where we live, where we work. It's progressing, I'll say that. I think that there's a lot of excitement about climate right now in the corporate space in terms of we actually want to do something about it. It's making those connections with the public sector, I think, there's probably a little bit of a gap right now in terms of the private-public partnerships. I think there's a lot of interest in working with NOAA, working with FEMA to do things for the communities where we operate within. It's just making those connections. I think that's kind of the next step for us. But I just wanted to highlight, Mastercard, we are trying to do as much as we can to identify risk across the portfolio of where we work, where our offices are, where our data centers are. But more importantly, the key thing is to understand what are the impacts to our employees and the communities surrounding our buildings. It's not just the built environment, it's the communities and the people that come in and out of our office every day as well.
I think this is all new for much of corporate America as well as our foundations. But what we found is that when we're working with the foundations and getting them to fund some projects, there are some interesting outcomes from that work and interesting things that's happening to accomplish great things. From the corporate side of things, what I see in terms of what we do is there are opportunities to partner and to collaborate. And so the thing that I can see, though, for corporate America and for the foundations is that when there's an opportunity to include people from the rural communities, from the indigenous communities in our state and in our country, then there's an opportunity to do really some good work.
And so I want to there's a couple, we just have a few more minutes, but one thing I do want to address is a little bit of the, sort of the elephant in the room, and that is the populations that live in rural areas, also, and their governments maybe are not as open or receptive to climate change. And so how do we communicate both the risk and the vulnerability around this issue in a political environment that is especially challenging? And I think we probably have 5 or 6 questions in this list already, asking about how we can do that in such difficult environments. So I'm gonna let any of you start.
I'll jump in. I just had this conversation with Pam from FEMA earlier this morning. That's a challenge that we face in Mississippi. We are extremely red state. We have a Republican supermajority at the state level, and climate change denialism is still permeates the political environment. So we're not going to be heard if we go to the Mississippi State Capitol and start talking about the impacts of climate change on Mississippians. We're not going to be heard. So I actually asked Pam, she's had some success in this area at the federal level in creating and curating messaging that has worked, and she suggested maybe changing the phrasing to disaster mitigation, talking about disaster preparation, adaptation, and mitigation instead of climate change. So I'm actually going to test that phrasing. Yeah.
Anybody else have any thoughts about navigating that political space?
I'll say kudos to you and Pam, and when you work it out, share with the rest of us.
Same for me.
But I'll also say I think climate change is just one of many issues that we as people, we have power, and we have to figure out how to utilize it and how to most effectively implement it. Interesting political climate, I will say that, but the issue is real. The need is real, and I think, again, collectively, we have got to come together to figure out how we address the issue, and hopefully we drag some others along. If not, we've done the right thing, and we're on the side of justice, so that's important.
I think, too, process of community roundtable discussions. When you get the issue pushed down to the grassroots level, those roundtable discussions can oftentimes influence the legislators because, people vote and they listen. So I think those type of collaborations with community groups and community organizations can be an influence in terms of making some of those changes in attitudes.
I think real quick too, it's important to talk about more than just the climate itself. You can talk about the impacts or the events that have happened, document that, get the oral history from folks at a local level. People in Texas cared a lot about climate change when that extreme cold event happened. They started talking about it a bit more. People care when Hurricane Florence hits or when a hurricane hits their backyard. So, you can avoid talking about climate change or not use the word climate change and still get this important information out there and talk to folks about it. I know it's a difficult journey sometimes, and some people might not be receptive of it, even if you don't mention the word climate change, because they'll make that connection themselves. But it doesn't hurt to try, and just to bring it to their, again, I always like to say backyard is kind of where you find the home to that climate change message, is in your own backyard.
I think I want to kind of plant a little seed here. It is, I haven't thoroughly tested this hypothesis, of course, but I actually think this is where the private sector can play a really important role, especially the finance and insurance sectors, but also industry. And that is talking about the impacts to their organization, the people they serve. And I think this does resonate in a way that is, not ideological, right? And so I definitely think this is one of the instances where I think the private sector can lean in and kind of help out a little bit on moving the needle some forward with some of these difficult conversations. So we have just a few minutes left, and all of you will hear me ask everybody this, because I think it's really important when we have these conversations. We often focus on the challenges. And so I'd like to ask you all about the opportunities. What gives you hope? What is one good opportunity that you see, or what gives you hope in this work? Because it's really important that we continue to focus on that, because it can get daunting, right, as we're trying to deal with these issues that seem to just not get traction, right? So I'm going to go down. Did I talk long enough to give you a second to think? Leah, you want me to start with Greg? Okay. Opportunities or hope?
I think private sector, I think there's some grand business opportunities out there to focus in on now that corporate America probably want to look at that and see where they go with that, because, climate change is with us. And as we know in America, business sector tends to, look at things and figure out some ways to address the issue and then turn it into a profit motive type of thing. So there's probably some new inventions out there that can come into play right now in terms of conserving energy and making the heat and air units more energy efficient in our homes. So I think those are opportunities that I would see. Certainly there are challenges. I don't know, how do we get a full force discussion going across our country that we have to do something. We have to make some change in terms of the way we're doing things in order to save lives.
Honestly, I have a lot of hope looking forward. I just think that there's a lot of interest in the climate topic right now. I think 5 years ago, if you would ask me when I was working with Ashley at CERC, whether I'd be working at Mastercard as their director of climate, probably wouldn't have been in the conversation at all. I think that there's a lot of interest in the topic. I think that there's a lot of conversations that need to be had between private industry, the public sector, governments, nonprofits. I think that there's a lot of momentum in this space right now, which excites me. Here at Mastercard, we're installing weather stations at some of our key sites. I think that's pretty exciting. Our employees are excited about it. They can go and look and see what the temperature is outside. We've installed solar panels in the parking lot in our O'Fallon office. It also provides shade to people. Their cars don't get as hot because they can park underneath the solar panels. I think there's just so many little ways climate is making its way into our lives. It's an everyday conversation. Weather, climate is a part of our everyday life. And I'm just excited to be part of the journey of kind of pushing this forward. And I just think, again, there's so many exciting ways that we can do private-public partnerships. And I think we're just kind of dipping our toe in the water there. There's a lot more to do in this space.
I'd say this moment gives me hope. I'll be very honest, I have not heard as much about heat and climate change probably in the last year than I've heard in my lifetime. And so bringing this diverse array of individuals who represent so many different sectors together, who are to figure out how we can work together to address this issue, is really an opportunity for hope for me.
I will say in Mississippi, what gives me hope is the relationships that a lot of us in this space have built with each other. Mississippi People's Movement, which is an alliance of about 30 different grassroots organizations working to address climate change through a climate justice lens. That's the first alliance of that type in Mississippi, and we're really starting to promote dialogue around climate, around heat, around disaster preparedness and mitigation, and this is new for Mississippi. This is very new. But also not just about climate change and the impacts, but how do we promote a just transition? How do we center communities that have been historically and deliberately marginalized in Mississippi? We know we're going to transition from an extractive, dirty economy to a clean, sustainable economy, and how are these communities that have been historically and deliberately marginalized, and how do they not get left behind in this transition? So I'm excited about the conversation that's happening in Mississippi. Also excited about the IRA funding that's coming down to Mississippi, which is a historic opportunity for investments in communities in Mississippi. And depending on, the administration that comes next, we may never see that level of investment again, and that gives me hope.
That's great. Thank you all. This has been a really wonderful conversation, and thank you for giving us your experience, your expertise, and your perspective on this topic. So just a quick round of applause for our panelists.